Welcome back to Pat Psychology Masters. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about two research approaches in psychology. The first is grounded theory, and the second is thematic analysis. These are two qualitative approaches. And at the end, I'm going to talk about how we can assess if qualitative research, such as a research project conducted using either of these theories, to see if it's any good. How do we assess its quality? How do we see that? Because it's not as obvious as a more quantitative project where we can look at the statistics. Typically in qualitative research, we're not looking at statistics, we're looking at descriptions, and it can be hard if we don't have a framework to see, well, is this research any good or not? But there are some guidelines that we can keep in mind to see, is this research valuable? Is it worthwhile? Is it conducted well? Or is it poor? So first of all, I'd like to talk to you about grounded theory. So grounded theory was developed in the 1960s by two researchers called Glaser and Strauss. It is a bottom-up approach to understanding a social process. So bottom-up means that it's inductive. The theory is generated from the data. Using the grounded theory approach, you're going to try and ignore any theoretical preconceptions you have. You can use your prior understanding of psychology to inform your analysis, but it shouldn't lead it. That'll become clear as I describe the grounded theory process. So if you're conducting a research project using grounded theory, you're going to collect data and analyse it at the same time. So let's take data collection first of all. So considering this is a qualitative approach, it might be unsurprising to learn that data can be collected in the form of interviews, focus groups, and even observations. So typically for observations, the researcher would be taking notes on what they're seeing. And a very important part of grounded theory is reflexivity in your note taking. So even as you're conducting an interview, or as you're conducting a focus group, or as you're analysing it, you're constantly writing notes about ideas that are coming into your mind about what seems to be emerging from the data, what's coming to your mind, so that you can use this later on to try and actually inform the theory that you're going to write. So first of all, that's memo writing. Then there's the other type of analysis that's conducted on the data is coding, and there are three types of coding. So you have your transcripts for your interviews, for your focus groups, and you have all your memos for your observations. So you're going to firstly open code this data. So this is, as you're reading it, you're going to maybe circle certain passages that seem to communicate a particular idea, and you're going to describe that idea and you're going to name it. And then you proceed, and then you reach another passage of text which seems to communicate another idea, and then you code that as well. And you do this for all of your data. Okay, so as you're doing this, you're kind of comparing the different codes you're getting. You're seeing, oh, that first code that I wrote where I talked about, let's say we were investigating the awareness of dying, which is actually where grounded theory came from. When Glaser and Strauss were investigating the awareness of dying, that's how they initially described the grounded theory approach. As an aside, let's say we're looking at the awareness of dying and the first code we write is pain. There's somebody saying, oh, it's very, very painful. Well, then we might code that as pain. And then later on we see, feeling very uncomfortable. We might code that as discomfort. And then maybe pain and discomfort are similar. I link them. I might write a note on that and say pain and discomfort seem to be two codes which are coming up a lot, and maybe they're related. So that's an example of your initial open coding and your memo writing. Your open coding is going to lead to the secondary coding process, which is called axial coding. So axial coding refers to generating a central theme, or like a central code to which all other codes are related to. So in the instance I gave there, pain might be the central theme, and different codes which might link to that could be discomfort, emotional pain, physical pain, the pain of loss, etc. And once you've developed this kind of, you can actually do it diagrammatically. So once you've developed like a branching axial code, you can then go on to the final coding process, which is called selective coding. And selective coding is really when your theory starts to become generated. And that's when you start looking at your axial coding and actually writing a narrative to describe it. And that narrative will become the grounded theory. And remember, it's grounded because it's coming from the data. Every part of the theory that you will describe, every part of the selective coding process that you will conduct is due to the information that you have collected from your participants, from your observations, from your focus groups, from your interviews, and from your memo writing. So grounded theory is a brilliant approach when you want to generate a theory which is new and not greatly or gravely influenced by older theories. So one thing I neglected to mention actually is you're collecting your data and you're doing the analysis at the same time. And that's very important because this analysis can lead you in terms of what data you're going to collect next. So you're kind of changing your methodological approach as you proceed. And you want to get to a stage where you reach what's called data saturation. So when you're asking different questions, you're asking new participants, or you're observing different scenarios, but yet you're getting the same information. Nothing new is coming up. When that point is reached, it's called data saturation. And data saturation can be accomplished by what's called theoretical sampling. So based on the emerging grounded theory, you can sample different sources of information that can potentially refute or confirm your theory as it emerges. So if it refutes a part of your theory, well, then you're going to need to either get rid of it or adapt it so that it describes the data better. However, if you're getting new data which is confirming your theory, well, then you're getting a more solid underpinning for this theory which is emerging. So grounded theory is a brilliant approach, but it does have its limitations. There are actually now different forms of grounded theory, and Glaser and Strauss, the two people that initially described it, actually kind of diverged in the 90s in their descriptions of how grounded theory should be used. And another researcher came up with a type of grounded theory called Constructivist grounded theory, which was in response to a lot of the criticisms that grounded theory would have got from people from a postmodernist perspective who might have said that, look, grounded theory is not useful today when we want to concern ourselves with people's subjective experience. Everything is relative. You can't generate a theory purely from objective data. There is no such thing as truth from objective data. You need to have more subjectivity in your analyses, and that was the total opposite of what grounded theory initially tried to describe. So with the rise of postmodernism, the objective and kind of positivist foundations of grounded theory started to basically become attacked, and that's where constructivist grounded theory grew from. So considering the different forms of it, it can be kind of confusing to a researcher who wants to employ the method. Well, which one should I use? Should I use the one that's described by Glaser? Should I use the one that's described by Strauss? Should I use the one that's described by Charmaz? Or should I use some other variation of grounded theory? So an example of a research question you might have for grounded theory could be vaping in secondary school students. Why do they do it? And this would be a good example because there's going to be a lack of research on this topic, considering it's such a new phenomenon, especially if you're looking at it specifically in the Irish context. So in recent years, there is going to be vaping research done, but there's going to be a limited amount done on Irish secondary school students. So using grounded theory, you can develop a new understanding of the phenomenon by conducting interviews, focus groups and observations. Now, this analysis and this data collection can be informed by prior research, which may be on smoking habits in secondary school students, but it should not direct your research entirely. It should just inform your approach, which is nigh on impossible, which is another kind of criticism of grounded theory. The instructions are to ignore theoretical preconceptions you might have, but in theory that may be simple, but in practice it's very, very difficult. So that's grounded theory. We'll put that aside for the moment and move on to another qualitative approach called thematic analysis. Thematic analysis has been conducted by psychology researchers for a large number of years now, but relatively recently, in 2006, there was an incredibly important paper which kind of described concrete steps from which to conduct thematic analysis. This paper was by Braun and Clarke. So they systematized the thematic analysis approach into 6 different steps. So let's say you've conducted your interviews and your focus groups and you've transcribed all the data. Well, step 1 then is to familiarise yourself with that data. So read through it a good few times and try and kind of immerse yourself in the data, get a sense of it. Step 2 was to start generating your initial codes. So similar to the coding process of grounded theory, you go through your data and you make codes based on what you're interpreting from it. Step 3, you then search for themes. So using these different codes, you compare and contrast them and see, are there any maybe overarching themes into which these codes might fall? So again, using the example of maybe emotional distress comes up and physical pain comes up. Well, you could maybe put those into a theme of physical and emotional distress, perhaps. The 4th step is to review those themes. So if there are any themes which are very, very similar, well, maybe you'll collapse them into one another. For example, let's say you have a theme of pain in the hand and another theme of pain in the arms. Well, you might just say physical pain is the overarching theme. You collapse them into one theme. The 5th step is to define and name your themes. So once you've reviewed them, you can actually start to really distinguish one theme from another theme from another theme. And then basically that's nearly the last stage. Once you've done that, you're just going to produce your report. So you're going to write down your findings, you're going to give examples of each theme, given quotations, given excerpts from the transcripts to support why you've taken these themes from your data. And then you can discuss those themes later on in your report. So thematic analysis is different to grounded theory in a couple of important ways. First of all, whereas grounded theory is inductive and it's more purely grounded in the data, well, thematic analysis can be either inductive or deductive. So, in other words, you can only generate codes and develop themes based on what you're seeing. Depending on either your inductive or deductive approach, you might get more or less manifest or latent themes. So a manifest theme is a theme which is explicitly in the data. A latent theme would be one that's maybe more deductive, or you're transposing something onto the data, you're interpreting it in a particular way which isn't explicit if you are just purely looking at the data. You may have developed this latent theme from, notes you were writing. So for instance, if a person was talking about something in such a way that they shifted in their chair a lot, or they were their body language suggested that they were very uncomfortable at the time, well then you could have a theme that might say, ill ease concerning whatever the subject matter was. So, if you're purely going down the inductive manifest theme approach, well, you couldn't really get that just from the pure transcript, but you could if you maybe were interpreting it in a certain way. So this coding process for thematic analysis kind of starts large and then narrows down as you proceed. So you might start off with 30 to 40 codes, which is obviously a lot. And then as you start reviewing your themes and naming them, you will end up with less themes than codes. So you're going to end up with maybe 5 to 7 themes as opposed to beginning with 30 or 40 codes. So you're kind of getting this funnel shape. The data is starting off with a very wide scope, and then you're kind of making it more succinct as you go down. So now that we have an idea of what grounded theory and thematic analysis is, how do we know if a report using grounded theory or thematic analysis is any good? Well, we can use criteria developed by Henwood and Pigeon in 1997. They have 7 criteria for assessing good qualitative research. So the first one is, how well does the analysis fit the data? How it stresses the importance of fit. So is the data explained well by the theory? If it isn't, well then it's probably not a good report. The second criterion for assessing quality is, how well does it integrate prior theory? So this could be a criticism of grounded theory. It's not necessarily using the large foundation of psychological research to inform the approach. It's by definition, it's going to try and ignore it a bit. So sometimes grounded theory might be overly ignorant to prior research, which isn't ideal. Not always, but sometimes. So that's an important consideration to make. Third consideration is that of reflexivity. So has the researcher identified their role in the report? Have they told you about what biases they might have? Have they told you how they felt during the whole process and how that might have affected their interpretation of the data? Or have they claimed to have a totally objective role? Because that's impossible. So if you feel like the author or the researcher isn't being forthcoming about their subjectivity in their attempt to write the report, well then you can start to question, how honest am I? How honest is this report? How can I be sure that it's as accurate as it could be? So, and similarly, the related point which comes next is documentation. So have they provided evidence of memo writing during the research process? Have they maybe talked about journaling throughout the research process? Have they provided evidence of the transcripts from which they conducted the analysis? Have they documented everything they have done? If they have, brilliant. If they haven't, maybe some of the data is spurious. Next is something that's incredibly important to grounded theory, and that's theoretical sampling and negative case analysis. So what sample has the researcher used, and have they used different samples, and if so, have they actively searched for data which would disconfirm their theory as it emerges. So this is a brilliant way to get a robust theory. If you interview 3 people and have a focus group of 4 people and observe another 2 people, you don't have a great sample size to maybe get transferable findings to other populations. You can't necessarily infer generalizability if you're only working like that with such small numbers. However, if you're using a larger sample, you're likely going to come across a diverse data set which will give you a foundation from which to generate a robust description and a robust theory. The penultimate consideration Henwood and Pigeon describe is that of sensitivity to negotiated realities. So, has the researcher involved the participant in understanding what's going on? Has the participant informed the understanding from their perspective, or has it purely just been from the researcher's perspective? So it's really important to get kind of what's commonly referred to today as PPI, participant and public involvement in the research, because that's going to give you a much, much greater informed approach in your psychological findings. Instead of purely expecting yourself to come up with the best ideas and the best interpretation of the data, actually involve your participants, actively seek their input, and this will generate what Henwood and Pigeon refer to as a negotiated reality. Not just your own subjective reality, but one that's true for both of you. Lastly, they describe the importance of transferability, and I referred to this for the theoretical sampling and negative case analysis. So basically this asks, how transferable are the findings from this research to another context? Did the research only look at college students in Dublin? And if it did, how transferable would this be to college students in Galway, or college students in Sydney, or college students in New Delhi? And even beyond that, does it transfer to older or younger populations who maybe aren't in education? So if the author is making claims that it does, that's dubious. If the author is maybe making suggestions for further research to see if their findings are true for different populations, well, that's something that you can get on board with. So there are good guidelines to keep in mind when you're interpreting qualitative research, and even just information in general. Consider the quality of the data sources. Consider the credibility of the author. Consider how applicable it is to your context. It's true of not just research, but of so many different realms of life. So that was a quick run through of grounded theory, thematic analysis, and how to assess quality in qualitative research. I'd be really curious to hear what you think about grounded theory and thematic analysis. Do you think it's any good based on what I've said? Do you think it's maybe a bit dodgy? Do you feel like those criteria that Henwood and Pigeon describe, do you feel like they're exhaustive? Do they cover all bases for assessing quality? Or, did they miss out on something? Really, really curious to hear what you think. That's going to be all from me today. I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments. Make sure to like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't, subscribe if you haven't already, and check me out on Instagram @PatPsychologyMasters. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.